It's in one of my servers.
It's not in the, it's in the Discord server?
It's in a different one than ours.
Yeah.
Oh, it is. Oh, okay.
But I'm sure you can link to an invite, send you over there.
I can send you an invite if you want one.
Oh, thank you.
All right, give me 2 seconds to sort of make sure we are fully being recorded and all that fun stuff, because I don't want to lose any of this. My internet has gone in and out lately, so if I drop, feel free to continue without me and keep going. I'm going to get Alistair in here.
Now recording.
Thank you so much. All right. All right, I'll probably kick us off here in just a moment then. It's a smaller group, that's okay. Varun's going to be taking off webcam. Are you able to stick around for a little bit?
Yeah, more than likely.
Cool. Then I think we'll just get underway and we'll see who joins as they join. I will, as always, share my screen, and I'll start by my normal wonderful ramble that everyone is probably just so excited to hear. But thank all of you for joining us for this wonderful Tuesday afternoon as we dive further into Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus. We're now moving into the end of 3.9, the Civilized Capitalist Machine, and we are the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective. As always, find us on social media, DNGQC on Twitter, DGQC on Patreon. If you want to support what we're doing, every dollar helps. Where we left off the end of last week, the end of last reading is the bottom of 238. I have it shared both on the YouTubes as well as in there. If you want to follow along, I figure I'll just dive directly in and we can keep chugging ahead as we move to the capitalist state, socialist states, and a few other bits of commentary, because this is a very dense section and there's a lot to discuss. There's every chance that we're going to spend the entire 2 hours on the next few paragraphs, which I'm fine with. We may end up making a whole discussion around this section next week. We'll find out. But for now, I'll do and dive in. Any last comments or anything before I do? All right. In comparison to the capitalist state, the socialist states are children, but children who learned something from their father concerning the axiomatizing role of the state. But the socialist states have more trouble stopping unexpected flow leakage, except by violence. What, on the contrary, is called the co-opting power of capitalism can be explained by the fact that its axiomatic is not more flexible, but wider and more englobing. In such a system, no one escapes participation in the activity of anti-production that drives the entire productive system. But it is not only those who man and supply the military machine who are engaged in an anti-human enterprise. The same can be said in varying degrees of many millions of other workers who produce and create wants for goods and services which no one needs. And so interdependent are the various sectors and branches of the economy that nearly everyone is involved in one way or another in these anti-human activities. The farmers supplying food to troops fighting in Vietnam, the tool and die makers turning out the intricate machinery needed for a new automobile model, the manufacturers of paper and ink and TV sets whose products are used to control the minds of the people, and so on and so on. Feel like I should have done a Zizek impression for that. Thus, the three segments of the ever-widening capitalist reproduction process are joined, three segments that also define the three aspects of its immanence. One, the one that extracts human surplus value on the basis of the differential relation between decoded flows of labor and production, and that moves from the center to the periphery while nevertheless maintaining vast residual zones at the center. Two, that one that extracts machinic surplus value on the basis of an axiomatic of the flows of scientific and technical code in the core areas of the center. And three, and the one that absorbs or realizes these two forms of surplus value of flux by guaranteeing the emission of both and by constantly injecting anti-production into the producing apparatus. Schizophrenization occurs on the periphery, but it occurs at the center and the core as well. Like I said, there's a lot said in almost every one of these paragraphs as we start getting towards the end of this book. Let's probably just take it sentence by sentence as we dive through. The opening here is the conversation around what we might call socialist states, what they may call socialist states, that learn something, that utilize violence to stop the leakage of these flows. The power of the state basically being that regulatory body that's able to control capital is how I'm reading this. The way that they're talking about it here. Again, the purpose of the state inside of capital doesn't change drastically. Socialist states just utilize it more strongly, having learned, as they say, the axiomatizing role of the state. That feels kind of what they're getting at with that first 2 or 3 sentences. I'll take that as a yes. The rest of the paragraph, I would like if anyone wanted to try to break down different parts, because there's a lot being said here. What on contrary is called the co-opting power of capitalism can be explained by the fact that its axiomatic is not more flexible, but wider and more englobing. Englobing being a wonderfully awkward phrase for it. But the idea here, as I read it, is capitalism is able to co-opt not because the rules, the axiomatizing nature of it is more flexible, but because the rules are vast and wide. They sit along this massive area. They're able to fully surround and sort of encompass, englobe the things that come at it. And to that point, because of it, no one inside the system, because it's englobening, I'm not sure I'm ever going to like saying that, because it englobes things, everyone ultimately is involved in the production of anti-production and in that process. And the quote here that they're talking about is sort of that line that we see a lot of times nowadays: there is no ethical consumption inside of capital. They may also add that there's no ethical production as well, since everything is sort of connected to everything and part of the entire process.
Yeah, I mean, the way you put it, but with everything being connected to everything else, is I guess it does make sense. So if we talk for Deleuze and Guattari, if we talk about the relationship between the state and capitalism, it would be best described as one of reciprocal presupposition. One cannot exist without the other. That's one of the things I think they're trying to get to with that paragraph. You know, they both need to coexist for there to be a sort of production model like this working. And also, you know, we can talk about this when it comes to codes and flows. So the same reciprocal presupposition is at work, right? You don't have a flow that's, you know, first a flow and then coded. They can't function without the other. So the code needs the flow to function, and the flow needs the code to function as well.
Yeah, anti-production. I mean, it really, to contrast it against the other socii, sociuses that came before. Anti-production in both of those modes is very deeply personal. It's related to you. It's very direct. Whereas within the capitalist sort of infrastructure, it's economic and produced, and it's this larger thing that sort of exists.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the other it's a real fascinating Nietzschean thesis of Anti-Oedipus, right? That, for starters, anti-production is itself something that's produced, right? That's where the Nietzschean thesis lies. It's also where, you know, if you read Anti-Oedipus, I don't think, it's hard to catch this on your first reading, but, you know, you sort of realize that this is Deleuze and Guattari's way of talking about, I guess, a possible solution to the contemporary dilemma that we live in, right? It's the fact that, you know, if everything is produced, we can, of course, produce things differently. But anti-production is never anti-production in itself. It's always the production of anti-production. At least that's for Deleuze and Guattari. That will be their general ontology in this book.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think the shift here, and they've been talking about it quite a bit, is the shift for the filiative and alliant natures of exchange or generation or whatever it may be, that axes, instead of being sort of found through the family or found through, tribal alliances or whatever it may, again, directly with you, sort of imminent to the experience. Now it's literally within capital. Capital is the alliant. Capital is the filiative. It's taken all of those things. It's all done through the money. I think they even say that a bit ago, the alliances and filiations no longer pass through people, but through money. And that shift is a significant trade. And with that comes anti-production, which before this was very much made sort of internally or through those connections. The anti-production that was produced came through those connections. And this sort of pushes it into another realm where it's this larger thing that's always happening within the economy, this far more complex, to say the least. Yeah. Remke asks, are those three aspects of its immanence comparable to the three syntheses? Well, let's go through them one at a time. My immediate reaction is going to be no, but let's go through them one at a time because I think it might be worthwhile. Vern, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, the whole point about the relationships between the three syntheses at the start of the book, right, with regards to desiring production, and the alliance filiative relationships as the aspect of social production, have to be again mapped on as a reciprocal relationship.
So the first of those, the three segments of it, segments of ever-widening capitalist reproduction are joined. The first segment is one that extracts human surplus value on the basis of the differential relation between decoded flows of labor and production, and that moves from the center to the periphery while nevertheless maintaining vast residual zones at the center. This is industrial capital, perhaps, might be a good way to put it. This is the differential relation between labor and production, and that differential that gets created in the form of surplus capital, surplus value, surplus labor, whatever it may be. This is sort of that first segment. The second one is the one that extracts machinic surplus value on the basis of an axiomatic of the flows of scientific and technical code in the core areas of the center. Facebook, Google, Tesla, I don't know, the things like that. The machinic surplus value on the basis of the axiomatic of the flows of scientific and technical code. The ownership of intellectual property would be an example of that. Currently, we have 4 companies that own all of the patents around the vaccine. Sorry, I find that depressing whenever I think about it. This would be the machinic surplus value on the basis of the axiomatic of the flows in scientific and technical code, kind of is that second one. And then the third is the last, which is the one that absorbs or realizes these two forms of surplus value of flux by guaranteeing the emission of both and by constantly injecting anti-production into the producing apparatus. Anti-production being not necessarily, again, it's its own very confusing thing to sort of discuss, but it's not like antimatter. It's more the blockages, blocks of unprocessable desire, unprocessable production, whatever it is, anti-production, these things that are in there. Do you have a better way to explain it, Varun, webcam? Because anti-production is its own sort of weird nightmare.
They're like 2 different senses of the word.
I mean, it's certainly weird in that it's not like not production, right? If that makes sense. In the sense that everything is produced. It's like it's kind of similar to the whole producing a lack thing.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
like you make the system at once.
Yeah. I mean, I guess a good way to explain it, right, is you need to first, if you want to be hungry, you need to first produce a digestive system that has the capacity to feel hunger.
Well, I mean,
And there you get production of lack.
we could go back because I think actually that's probably a best way to explain it, because again, a lot of their argument in this entire book is that the nature of production, whether molar or molecular, isn't, separate things, that there's a lot of similarities. And so when we talk about the disjunctive connection inside of the three syntheses, to go back to those, Rimke, the three syntheses of the connective, disjunctive, conjunctive. This second one where the disconnection happens. Think of a baby with a mother's breast suckling, or someone sees I think their example is seeing the sun, connection of a lock of hair, whatever these things are. We need the moment of being pulled away from it. We can't just stay forever. And it's this anti-production is the thing that does this. Anti-production is the function that suspends one connection to allow another in this sort of open-ended if then series. Maybe I'm phrasing that wrong, but that's the placement of it. So the body without organs ultimately frees us from this animal instinct of never stopping and eating ourselves to death or anything like that. The anti-production is this thing that sort of sits in that process and goes, hello, what about this other thing? And off you go to the next one. And it's not really anti-production, which I know the word says that, and it's fucking wild, but it's more just the break in the thing. It suspends one connection for another. Like that, when we're talking about anti-production here, I believe we're talking about the way that flows can be attached from one place to another, to another, to another, and injecting anti-production into the apparatus is what the emission of both of these, the surplus value of flux, enables. So that way, the producing apparatus can go produce another. The following sentence is, schizophrenization occurs on the periphery, but also occurs at the center and core as well. The schizophrenization, as they're describing it, and as they've talked about it, is the nature of that then, unending continuous connection to new.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the most radical thesis of this book that, once you sort of makes things a bit clearer, which is itself another puzzle, is if we look at what Marx did, one way to simplify Marx is to say that his study of economics was the analysis of the way labor is organized in a society. And I mean organized literally in the most general sense of the term, right? So one clear fact is that labor is bought and sold, and you have laborers and you have people who are owning basically renting this labor for a brief period of time and then trading it and so on and so on. Deleuze and Guattari are going to do the same thing, except they're going to say this labor is the same thing as desire, and desire is being organized in a specific way, and this organization of desire leads to the production of things like lack. In the same way, the organization of labor within capitalism leads to the production of things like surplus value.
Yeah, anti-production is its own very interesting discussion. We should I'll make a note that we need to do again, as we near the end of this, before we hit chapter 4, we're going to do the big round tables again, because I think that was a really great time last time, and we'll do a little bit wider things so we can have a wider net over the discussion of these major elements, because I think what you're talking about is it's a deeply radical move in terms of the literal organization of production and our unconscious. And it's really answered your question ultimately, though, Rimka. Any other things people want to discuss in this paragraph before I move on? All right. The definition of surplus value must be modified in terms of the machinic surplus value of constant capital, which distinguishes itself from the human surplus value of variable capital and from the non-measurable nature of this aggregate of surplus value of flux. It cannot be defined by the difference between the value of labor capacity and the value created by labor capacity, but by the incommensurability between two flows that are nonetheless immanent to each other, by the disparity between the two aspects of money that express them, and by the absence of a limit exterior to their relationship, the one measuring the true economic force, the other measuring a purchasing power determined as income. The first is the immense deterritorialized flow that constitutes the full body of capital. An economist of the caliber of Bernard Schmidt finds strange lyrical words to characterize this flow of infinite debt. An instantaneous, creative flow that the banks create spontaneously as a debt owing to themselves, a creation ex nihilo that, instead of transferring a pre-existing currency as means of payment, hollows out at one extreme of the full body a negative money, a debt entered as a liability of the banks, and projects at the other extreme a positive money, a credit granted to productive economy by the banks. Quote, a flow possessing a power of mutation, quote, that does not enter into income and is not assigned to purchases of pure availability, non-possession, and non-wealth. The other aspect of money represents the reflux, that is, the relationship that it assumes with goods as soon as it acquires a purchasing power through its distribution to workers or production factors, through its allotment in the form of incomes. A relationship that it loses as soon as the latter are converted into real goods, at which point everything recommences by means of a new production that will first come under the sway of the first aspect. The incommensurability of the two aspects, the flux and the reflux, shows that nominal wages fail to embrace the totality of the national income, since the wage earners allow a great quantity of revenues to escape. These revenues are tapped by the firms and in turn form an afflux by means of a conjunction, a flow, this time uninterrupted, of raw profit, constituting at one go an undivided quantity flowing over the full body, however diverse the uses for which it is allocated, interest, dividends, management salaries, purchase of production goods, etc. Is that the end of that paragraph? Please say yes. Or does it continue?
I think that's a good place to
We're going to stop there for a
stop
moment.
for a sec anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Regardless, because Jesus Christ. Otherwise, that's a 3-page paragraph. Pass on that.
Which, I mean, they definitely do that, but, you know.
Yeah, we'll stop because I think that's a fair break in the point they're trying to make anyway, before they move on. So, Webcam, would you like to jump off on this?
Well, I suppose maybe a weird consideration I'm thinking of is like when they're talking about the banks kind of creating this negative and positive push, right? Like there's the debt, which then allows them to move money around and get the system going. It kind of makes me think of a phenomenon in physics, which I only bring up because Guattari is kind of prone to using terms from physics, like he talks about black hole subjectivities and things like this. And it's sort of along the same lines as that, where virtual particles, can come into existence, an antiparticle, and then it's positive, and it's okay for them to just appear as long as at some point they collide and annihilate themselves. And some theorist, like Leonard Susskind and a few others, proposed this as a physical explanation for how the universe came about, right? This kind of like, it's kind of like a cosmic debt that is paid eventually. And I don't know, it just kind of reminds me of that same thing, that in the same way an entire universe can come from this ex nihilo false debt, you can also have an entire economy.
I'm with you. I think I look at just as a comparison to a thing that I don't think even existed as a financial instrument, but credit default swaps and how they operate and how they generate value. A business goes to a bank and says, I need money to get going. And this company, the bank goes, excellent, we will loan you that cash. Whether or not they have it, it doesn't even matter at that point, because that company, then they produce it, they convert immediately. But on the other side, the bank also sells that debt to others, or even a third party who's uninvolved creates a credit default swap and sells it. The idea that, oh, well, I think company X is actually going to go belly up, and I will pay off that debt if they do. Someone else then buys the promise of paying off the defaulted debt in exchange for monthly payments to the third party. It's completely unrelated to the original thing. So now you have people borrowing against other people's debt, creating value and being paid for it. Credit default swaps still happen now. Like, this is not a 2008 thing. Like, it's insane that this shit still happens. And it's actually worse than that. Like, this is my very simplified version of it, but it's all I can think as they read through this, where they're talking about these banks that ultimately, as you said, they sort of create money out of a negative, whole cloth. I don't even know how to phrase it, but it's spot on as a way to describe pure availability, non-possession, and non-wealth. And then the reflux, which is as soon as that money becomes a thing, the business that we're loaning the money to, they've converted that cash to production, and they've made a whole bunch of sodas or pot or whatever, and then they sell that. It changes. It changes from this sort of pure availability to raw purchasing power. The difference, again, as they talked earlier about, between money and investment capital. Money and capital are not the same thing, I think, is the continuing point they're making here.
I mean, I guess like the whole point in like making this observation would be to say that for a lot of people, right, like money or capital directly correlates to reality, right? Like, oh, this apple is worth this much money, and like that's just how much it is worth. And this is kind of like showing that actually it's just completely fabricated. Like, it's not based on anything except the system itself designating that it should be that much, right? There isn't like this hidden reality behind the cost of the apple. Which I mentioned because, that would typically be seen as like a liberal defense of the capitalist project, right? Did we lose Brooks?
I muted myself, is the problem. But I was commenting on Tesla being a really good example of that. That Tesla's capitalization is excessively high, and is actually the following 12 car companies combined has the same valuation, whereas Tesla sells $1.5 billion worth of cars, and they sell something in the neighborhood of $50 to $100 billion worth of cars every year. And so it's this weird, they've actually converted the capital over to product, to money, to things, whereas Tesla is pure availability, which I like that phrasing because it's a really solid setup. And yes, Ben is spot on. Tesla makes all of their money selling carbon credits. If you've ever voted for anyone to do carbon credits, Tesla is the people who helped write that law, because they get all their money from it, and they would be negative every single year without it. So It's a fun one. But I don't think far from the point. Again, talking about the two aspects of money that express them. This
I think I don't remember if it's particularly in Anti-Oedipus or by Deleuze, which at this point have all blended together. But I was reading Braudel, who makes a very similar point that money is actually like foreign to exchange commerce. Like it's not necessary in order for a meaningful system of commerce to exist.
And I think it's a unique critique as well, because the critique of capital as a system, I mean, they go through and there's a lot of critiques, but as they start breaking apart the different pieces, again, talking through how the affiliative or the alliant operate within this, how anti-production is made, and actually discussing how the organization of production starts to happen. It's not just a blanket capitalism bad. It is a, look, here's a deep critique of the system, and here's how things function, and we really need to make an understanding of that, so we're not just, I don't know, screaming at the top of our lungs about market economies or money or any of these other things that I think are more irrelevant to the discussion than what we might be able to do about it. And it ends, and I think I'll then move on to the next paragraph, the ending of this. These revenues are tapped by the firms and in turn form an afflux by means of a conjunction, a flow, this time uninterrupted, of raw profit, constituting at one go an undivided quantity flowing over the full body, however diverse the uses for which it is allocated. The nature of as capital gets turned into revenue and profit that again gets sort of sent back out into this world rather than converted into production or monetary recuperation and remuneration, salaries, income, things like that. It does make its move. Raw profit constitutes at one go an undivided quantity flowing over the full body, however diverse the uses for which it is allocated. And suddenly it's this very different thing as it's playing in that direction. That's going to be important as we kind of make our way through the rest, because this afflux to the entire thing, this mass surplus of things that are uncoded, I think they're about that. Well, I'll get through the rest of the paragraph. I don't want to make determinate statements and spoil it ahead of time. Any last comments before I move forward? All right. The incompetent observer has the impression that this whole economic schema, this whole story, is profoundly schizo. The aim of the theory is clear, a theory that refrains, however, from employing any moral reference. Who is robbed is the serious implied question that echoes Clavel's ironic question, who is alienated? Yet no one is or can be robbed, just as, according to Gavel, one no longer knows who is alienated or who does the alienating. Who steals? Certainly not the finance capitalist as the representative of the great instantaneous creative flow, which is not even a possession and has no purchasing power. Who is robbed? Certainly not the worker, who is not even bought, since the reflux or salary distribution creates the purchasing power instead of presupposing it. Who would be capable of stealing? Certainly not the industrial capitalist as the representative of the afflux of profit, since profits do not flow in the reflux, but side by side with, deviating from, rather than penalizing the flow that creates incomes. How much flexibility there is in the axiomatic of capitalism, always ready to widen its own limits, so as to add a new axiom to a previously saturated system. You say you want an axiom for wage earners, for the working class and the unions? Well then, let's see what we can do. And thereafter, profit will flow alongside wages, side by side, reflux and afflux. An axiom will be found even for the language of dolphins. Marx often alluded to the golden age of the capitalist, when the latter didn't hide his own cynicism. In the beginning, at least, he could not be unaware of what he was doing, extorting surplus value. But how this cynicism has grown, to the point where he is able to declare, no, nobody is being robbed. For everything is then based on the disparity between two kinds of flows, as in the fathomless abyss where profit and surplus value are engendered. The flow of merchants' capital's economic force, and the flow that is derisively named purchasing power. A flow made truly impotent that represents the absolute impotence of the wage earner, as well as the relative dependence of the industrial capitalist. This is money and the market, capitalism's true police. There's a lot said there. So we'll start with what I think is the telling line here, because there's a lot of people who come out of this with a lot of different lines. The incompetent observer is the one who sees all of this as profoundly schizo. That's to me a telling line. And this whole thing is not schizophrenic. That's not the setup. No. It's all these. There's this way of looking at it. Sure, you could say, "Oh my gosh, what about this? What about that? Who knows what's happening? All this is crazy." And it's to them, they're like, "No, pull back. We now know actually how people are being robbed, and it's through the use of these two separate flows. And the one, which ultimately is what makes not only the worker impotent and fucked in this process, but also creates some level of dependence for the industrial capitalist, and that's money, the market, capitalism's true police." If someone wants to dive into any of these elements, I do like that phrasing a lot. I'd love to know anyone's thoughts on this, for sure.
Well, a radical term seems to be, I can't remember the exact wording, but they said about not presupposing the value of the worker's contribution or whatever, which seems like the most radical turn away from, like, for instance, the Marxist analysis, right? In that, I suppose Marx puts like an inherent value on what is produced, right? Like outside of, we could say, like outside of the economic like concerns within capitalism. He's saying like there's a certain value that comes from being a laborer, like doing labor. And they're saying what Deleuze and Guattari seem to kind of be saying here is that, well, from a certain position at least, we can see that there's no point at which where we can just presuppose this inherent value to the labor, just because it's already caught up in a system whereby that labor would be valuable at all, right? Like the labor can't exist on its own and just have a certain value, which isn't to say that Marx is wrong about a lot of the other things that he says, but rather that like the problem is more insidious because the system has become like pre-codeterminate with regard to the worker and the capitalist, right?
Yeah, I like that. I think to me the way that they're discussing and talking about this is sort of, I don't know, the incompetent that they're describing here as a thing is someone who sees this entire system and goes, "Oh my God, look at all the possibilities," without realizing we're talking about really two flows, and that one of the flows, yes, is one of sort of this ridiculous infinite possibilities, the way he talks about this profit as it runs, but that money and the market ultimately are the chains that everyone's bound in within this, that there is that element, but we're talking about a schizophrenic who ultimately is deeply bound by significant chaining to the process of what these things mean and representation of it all. The organization and how it sort of plays with it. Because capitalism can do whatever we need. Oh, you need workers' rights? Oh, I'll give you some of those. That's great. Have fun with it. And we still have money at the bottom that ultimately it doesn't matter. It's the purchasing power, the flow made impotent, that represents the absolute impotence of the wage earner, as well as the relative dependence of the industrial capitalist.